So, any further additional announcements? Doing a liquidity seminar this evening after recitation. Zach and Bernardo will have a recitation about a good one on present value math and also some. Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to start recitation off by doing the monocentric city components that you'll get in class today. So if you don't want to stay for the present value math and organization components, if you want to think through the monocentric city components that you'll hear more about today, you're welcome to do that or leave early, up to your discretion.
Okay, so a good recitation, but it's optional, and then a liquidity seminar. Last week we went to Money Charles. I don't know if we'll do that again, but probably we'll go somewhere. And this class presently has 92 people trying to get in, and there's 61 seats here. One of two things is going to happen fairly soon. Either a lot of people will start dropping out, which I wouldn't be surprised. Usually in the past that has happened. But I have to admit, this is taking me a bit by surprise. We've not had anywhere near this volume of demand or in recent years. And also that it continues, like after the first class or two. And I don't think I was like more scary in those previous years than I have been now. So here I have to tell you guys, and even if you drop out of the class after this, this could be the most important thing you learn. The last time I had demand like this for this class was 2007. There was demand like this. There was demand like this for about 3 years, 2005, 6, and 7. Those years coincided with the bubble. And after that, you know what happened. So, who knows? But it might be a leading indicator. You may have some inside information here. Batten down the hatches. Be ready for a possible downturn. Not maybe this year or next year, but you saw those indexes that I put up. You saw that the prices, at least in some markets, are above what they were in 2007. So, what else? Homeworks, we're going to give you guys a little bit of grace period in the first week or so, but after that, you got to have your homework in on time or we'll get 0 credit. And it is altogether 20% of the course grade. But remember, I don't want you to spend a whole lot of time on the homework. The homework is designed to get you thinking in a very concrete way about the material. But it's not like trying to test you so that you get it right or wrong. So spend like an hour on it, maybe 2 hours. Use your own judgment how useful it is for you, and then submit whatever you have. If you literally cannot come up with any answer at all to the question, explain where you're stuck. And just put that in a little note in the thing that you post for the TAs. But above all, at that point, you're going to do what? You're going to go to the Stellar Forum and post that question in the forum. That's another part of your grade. Everybody has to post some stuff. I forget what the exact ground rules we set up. It's in the syllabus. You have to post at least, I forget the whole thing. 3 or anyway, read it in the syllabus. We don't want to possibly misquote it. So there's already been some great questions posted to the forum, and I have taken great care to give great answers to the great questions. I haven't been able to look at it for real reason. But there's another thing. I will take, from the forum posts, I will take one question and put it on the quiz that's, that corresponds to that module. So in module 1, I'll look for all the posts that you guys have made, and I'll find one that will make a good quiz question, maybe with some slight modification, and that will be one of the questions on the quiz, and which gives you more incentive to keep up with the forum and review that stuff. The person whose question I picked will receive a complimentary bottle of my son's home brew. So that's another incentive. So with that, we're going to delve a little more into our Walden Woods case. But you know what? Before we do this, I actually want to go back and pick up from the discussion on Monday. Right. We didn't get quite as far in our discussion as I wanted to. I do want to make sure that you guys understand one point here. But I don't know if we really had time to get to. So I'm not sure quite. I'm trying to show two PowerPoints at once.
Isn't there a second screen?
Sorry.
I think.
They overlap.
Oh.
Yeah, they do overlap, but I think.
45.
Can you guys all see this? So remember, we've got in the space market supply function that's kinked and demand that can grow or shrink. And supply mostly can only grow, but when it grows, whatever's there is stuck there, and that's the vertical inelastic part of the supply function. And then as demand grows, supply can grow, and the cost at which the new supply comes in is the development cost. So we have this thing called the replacement cost rent. In this example is $16 a square foot. The replacement cost rent, quoted on a net basis. Now rents are quoted two ways. That's even more complicated than that, but in big picture, simplistically, there's gross rent and net rent. Gross rent is what the tenant pays to the landlord, but the landlord is going to be responsible for the operating expenses of the space. So the gross rent is not the net income of the landlord. You have to subtract out the operating expenses from the gross rent, and then you get the net rent, which is what really matters to the landlord. But sometimes rents are quoted net to begin with, or you might be focusing on the net operating income of the property, which is already net of the operating expenses. So if we're quoting on a net basis, the replacement cost rent is going to be the cap rate in the market, 8% here, times the full development cost, which includes the land cost as well as the construction cost, plus the necessary profit for the developer. So that's the full development cost. Profit is actually a cost because it's simply, you have to, society has to pay that, or the investors, the buyers have to pay that, or the developer is not getting compensated for their time and risk and so forth. So profit is actually part of what is necessary cost. Yeah, so
what is typically the percentage that profit is?
It's gonna vary, and that's too simplistic of a way of looking at it, because what we really want to do is look at the net present value. But we will be getting into that in great depth, more depth than you may even want to.
So
we're just skimming the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg in this module. In Module 4, we will really study in great depth the economics of development investments.
Okay.
So, so at this tip of the iceberg level, we can think of this replacement cost rent, which is the kind of the long run, the rent to which, sort of in mean reversion sense, the rents are going to maybe cycle around this, but they will tend to return to that level, over time. And we could be talking about a long amount of time here, so we better think in terms of real dollars adjusted for inflation. But that's the basic concept of replacement cost rent and the formula. Okay, cap rate times total development cost. So I wanted you to make sure that you understood that. And how does that come out in our Walden case? So we look over here. We're given the thing really in two different levels, two different perspectives. From the perspective of the developer's cost and from the perspective of the value of the built product. And this partly relates to your question, Joseph. In this particular example, the total cost of the development, not yet including the profit for the developer, is $147 per square foot. And then the developer needs $21 per square foot of profit. And that means that the final, the construction cost is 147, the land is 21. So the total cost, including land but not including developer's profit, is 168. We add $21 of developer's profit, which at least they, apparently Boston Properties was thinking that was a sufficient expected profit for this deal, for this project. $21 of profit, meaning that if they could sell it for $189, then it's going to be okay. Now, in terms of what's actually driving this thing, what's really driving it is the space market, right? The supply and demand of office space in that part of Boston. Will they pay $23.50 of gross rent? If they will, then we can subtract out $6.50 of operating expenses and vacancy allowance, and we come down to a net rent of $17 a square foot. Expressing this in terms of cap rates, what this is saying is that if the market will bear, that the real estate property market, the asset market, will pay a price expressed as 9% cap rate, and if indeed the space market will enable us to get $17 of net rent, including consideration for vacancy, then we will indeed be able to sell the building for the $189, which is what we need to cover the cost of $168 plus the necessary profit of $21. Okay, and this $23.50 number, in some sense, that's the crucial thing. That's the driver. That's what underlies it all. If the space market is not there for us, if the supply and demand for this kind of usage of this kind of space is not such that we can charge $23.50 for it, then the thing isn't going to work. Right? It's not going to be able to provide the developer with that $21 profit that he needs. But the other part of thing that makes this work is not just the space market, it's also the asset market, the property market, which remember is part of the capital market, that's the market where money is coming in, right? Investment money. And that's where this building would be competing with stocks and bonds and anything else that investors can do with their money. And that's where the 9% comes in. If the supply and the demand equilibrium in that market is such that we can sell these buildings at a 9% cap rate, then if indeed the space market will give us the $23.50, then we get our $189 and the thing works. So that's what's really driving this thing. And we can see later how this would play out in a net present value sense, which is really the more important way to look at it, because here we're not really rigorously taking account of time and risk, which is really what investment is all about, time and risk. But these are sort of the shorthand numbers that effectively reflect that. And so that's looking at it from the value perspective.
On what basis is the cap rate different, 10 versus 9%?
Well, that's what I was about to get to.
Oh.
So that's looking at it from the value perspective, from the perspective of the asset market, or the market for stabilized properties, for completed properties. Now, if you're a developer, you have a solid idea of what the cost is going to be, and you want to think about, well, what's going to make, given that this is going to be the cost, not including my profit, what's going to be the kind of pricing I need to be able to get when I go to sell this thing in the property market, such that I can cover that cost and have enough profit for this to be worthwhile for me. And that's where the 10% comes in. So basically the developers the 10% really comes in from this $21 here. You could think of it as developers figuring, I need $21 of expected profit for this to make sense to me. Therefore, I need to be able to sell this thing in the asset market at a 10% cap rate on cost, or the 10% here is applied to the 168, which is the same thing as the 9% here being applied to the 189. Right, so we back out the 10% from the need for the $21 of profit. Okay, so it's really two different ways of quoting the pricing. One is from the perspective of the cost that the developer is facing, not including the profit, and the other is from the perspective of the value that the building would have, such that that's got to, the developer's got to be able to get his profit out of that, because that's what the building can be worth in the property market. So the bottom part here is the same on both sides. This is all coming from the space market. And the top part of it is the same, meaning the cost part of it. The wedge, that's the difference between the 10% and the 9%, is the developer's profit here, the $1 million. Okay? And when people talk about replacement cost rents, you could quote it from either perspective, but more commonly you're going to be talking about the market cap rate. It's the 9%, that's the number that's very widely out there that you can observe, in all the transactions that occur. Most of the transactions that occur in the property markets are transactions for existing stabilized properties, not for development deals. So the cap rates that you can most easily observe, especially the pricing that's out there, are usually these market value cap rates, like the 9%, or like over here, the 8%. Right? So, questions?
So, that formula assumes that the rent will be perpetual and will always be at that same level, right?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really assume that. That's all built into the 9. They might actually need, say, a 12% return, total return, but they can get, if these rents are going to grow, or these net rents are going to grow at 3% per year forever, then you will get a 12% return if you can sell it at a 9% yield, because the income component of the return, the current initial income component of the return, plus the growth, is going to give you the total return.
But
So,
then we have to factor in the growth into that same formula.
So you're going at 11.
Just looking at
So
it from a
her
financial
question is about this rent here may grow, and we're just looking at an initial value, and that's certainly true. And when we go to look at a longer-term, multi-period perspective, and we begin to take time and risk explicitly into account, that'll all come out. These are the back-of-envelope short-term numbers that's kind of the first level, tip of the iceberg to get into it. And also, honestly, a lot of the deals that are done in the real world, this is as deep as they get. As an academic, I can scandalize to say that, but it's really true. So, okay, that's what I wanted to pick up on from last Monday. So for today, we had a couple more questions about the history of the zoning of the site and how you would describe the business strategy. I want you to think a little bit about, as I say, think about routine development or investment versus entrepreneurial, meaning innovative or pioneering development or investment. You guys at MIT, this is the world capital of innovation and entrepreneurship, right? And I think this case is an example. Edlendu is an MIT alum, right? He's going to be, like all good MIT alums, he's going to be doing not just routine stuff. He's going to be trying to do entrepreneurial, innovative, pioneering kind of stuff. So when you think about the business strategy that they were trying to employ there in that case, the way it failed, you can learn more from failure than from success. And so that's the perspective that I would kind of like for you to think about this in. I didn't explicitly give you that much of a hint in the homework, but because I figured you guys might go that direction on your own. But, and of course, I'm always open to other perspectives on this. But I can't use the clicker in this one. So the zoning history, I was gonna, do a cold call with the random student generator, but we actually already talked about this on Monday, didn't we? And we noted that, before 1965, it was non-commercial zoning, if it was any zoning at all, and it was non-commercial. I don't know, maybe it was residential, maybe it was agricultural, maybe it wasn't zoned. The point is, it was far enough out there beyond the development boundary of the Boston metropolitan area that it wasn't really viewed as needing zoning, at least not needing commercial zoning. And then it got zoned to hotel and restaurant, which was really a type of use that would have been really aimed more at the local Concord market. Well, I don't know, because it's on Route 2, which is a state highway, so maybe they're thinking they're getting the transient traffic, but it's already close enough to Metro Boston that why would you stay out there instead of just completing your trip to Boston? I don't know, but anyway, that didn't work, right? Nobody built anything there. So then in 1980, it's zoned for office, which is more of a high value, more of a central location kind of usage of land, particularly the Class A office types of large floor plate, modern, high amenity offices like they were going to build. So actually, here's a picture I found on the internet. This is an aerial photograph of Concord in 1938. You couldn't get aerial photographs much earlier than 1938, but so here's the Sudbury River, Ascot River come together to make the Concord River here. Here's central Concord Center, and this is Route 2. It already existed in 1938. It wasn't like a super highway, limited access highway or anything. This is Walden Street, which comes from downtown Concord and goes south towards this area right down here is the Walden Pond, which is now the state park, and the area where Thoreau actually built his cabin. And here on Thoreau Street is where they're going to build high school, Concord Carlisle area high school in 1958. That's 20 years in the future for this picture. This area here is Brister's Hill. This area here was the Concord Town Forest already. And what do you see? What do you see in this land use here? Let me put it this way: does this look like a suburb?
No.
No, why not?
It's very compact around the historic center. There, it creates the farms and then quickly to woods.
Right. This is a bucolic agricultural community. Really, this is a small town centered, around the town center, and it's got population largely living around the center here, and around that are agricultural fields and some woods. There's no single-family housing tract development. There's no there's not the kind of suburbs that would occur after World War II, based on the automobile commuting from from a suburb into a central city. There would be a little bit of commuter people living here and commuting into Boston, because this is the MBTA commuter rail line. Actually, in 1938, I don't think the MBTA existed yet, but it was a private rail line. But the rail station is right around here, and so there were some people. It was what you call a commuter rail suburb, but that's not the same as the whole area being, in general, an automobile-based suburb. So in other words, the boundary of the Boston metropolitan area clearly at this point in time had not reached Concord. The main point to make there. Here's the history of the percent of the land forested in Concord. So it was first settled in 1635. The first European settlement around here was in 1620 in Plymouth. And then in 1630 was the big settlement of a whole group of Puritans that came over and founded Boston. And they founded Cambridge. And a group of them, already by 5 years after that, 1635, they went out to Concord and bought some land from the Indians and established a settlement out there. At that time, it was 90% forested. The 10% that wasn't forest was probably some natural meadows, and the Indians actually did, the Native Americans, they had agriculture, and they did have some fields. However, only about 10% of them were left from having experienced the diseases that the Europeans brought over. Anyway, by 1700, 30% of it is cleared. By the time of the beginning of the Revolution, a battle that started the American War for Independence, right there in Concord in 1775, by then it's almost all cleared. The forest is down to only 30%, and 70% of it is farms. 1800, even more, and 1850 is the peak of the farming period. And after 1850, what happened is you had railroads and canals that connected the eastern Atlantic seaboard of the U.S. with much richer farming lands in the Midwest. Through the Erie Canal and the Great Lakes, through railroads that began to be built. And the result was that, because the land is not so great for farming in New England. It's hilly, it's rocky, the soil isn't very fertile, the climate's really fickle, and so there was a great migration of farmers from New England to the west, to upstate New York, to Ohio, and further. And so farm fields got abandoned. And they had actually converted a lot of them over already by 1850 to pasture, grazing sheep. There were millions of sheep in New England in the mid-19th century, supplying wool to all the textile mills of the Industrial Revolution that really started here in New England. It started first in Old England, but shortly after that it really started in New England. And so sheep were being grazed there, but even that, became more economical to do elsewhere. And so the fields started reverting to forest again. And by the mid-20th century, it was already back to 50% forest. Some of it was cut for timber, but then it would grow back basically in timber production. But then what happened after World War II, that's when you got the suburbanization. And so by 2000, we're back down to 30% forest. And by that point, the other 70% is housing, suburban housing. So, the point here is the dynamism of land use, right? How the highest and best use changes over time. And it changes in response to the dynamism of a metropolitan area. It's growing and changing in its economic base, and also the technology is changing, transport technology, incomes are growing, and so forth. So we will ask a little bit from the homework about the business investment strategy, and we will draw on the random student generator, which our TAs will generate for us.
Maine soup.
That's the thing about the random student generator is it's with replacement. But remember, you can pass. The thing, would you like to tell us?
I think from the economic background, at that time the vacancy rate is very low, and also although the interest rate is high, people are very eager to find new places to make investments in the Boston area. And also from the HBU theory, this place is very suitable for a high-end office. I think there's going to build very luxury housing projects. So people who live here, they can become the potential tenants for this building. So I guess it's.
So if you had to summarize in one short sentence the business strategy, the investment strategy, how's the essential way they were going to make money for this investment? What were they trying to do?
trying to make the most productive at that time.
So they're trying to, you're basically saying they're trying to maximize the
Yeah.
value of the thing they're gonna build. But specifically, how would they do that? What is the kind of thing that they're gonna try to build in order to, what's gonna make what they're gonna build do that? Does somebody else want to give a suggestion?
Michael.
Mike?
The highest and best use given the zoning that they're going to do is how they'll develop the land.
Well, they're gonna do, so maximize value is almost synonymous with saying we're gonna build the highest and best use. In fact, it is synonymous. That's the definition of highest and best use. Highest and best use is the use that maximizes value. So specifically,
I think it's about the transportation because at that time the transportation system spread from the Boston area, especially the 128. It connect very wellly and think if the office there can save.
okay, it's gonna be related to inner beltway. 128 is the inner beltway. So, you know, here's the ocean, here's this Boston CBD, and here's Route 128, which was the inner beltway, which was built in the 1950s. And by this time, fairly recently, in the 1960s and 70s, they built an outer beltway, 495. And there is Route 2 there, and Concord is here. So I agree with you that the business strategy for maximizing the value is somehow related to 128. We need to be more specific than that. Who else wants to chime in? Paul?
Given the context of like the 1960s and 70s, the 128 quarter was growing a lot, so the rent expectation was increasing, and they thought that they could bank on a strong economy in the location as Boston pushed outward, particularly to the northwest one, 128.
So, I mean, basically what happened is this area of 128 here, I mean, the CBD had always been the place of the peak rents, the greatest densities, the top offices, but with the high-tech boom that really began during and after World War II, but it really picked up steam in the 1960s and 70s, this area here became the favorite location for a lot of these offices, especially of high-tech companies. Offices and laboratory spaces, and so this was really the booming area. It became almost like an edge city, and by 1980, this is pretty built up, right? Pretty built out already, right? So, so you're saying that. Sorry, repeat your point.
They essentially as what you're saying, 128 had already been the frontier of development for the last 20 years, and the 80s saw another boom, or was the end of another boom,
Right.
And they were looking to be on the next part of the frontier, which would just be just
Right.
north of your little circle there.
So the boundary of the Boston metropolitan area had been expanding, moving outward. And certainly the residential usage had already gone to Concord and beyond, but commercial usage, much higher value use, had leaped from the CBD to this area and had fully built out this area. So the strategy, the business strategy, investment strategy, is to catch that next movement out, thinking that, okay, this high value use here, it's all built up here, it's going to move right to here. And so maybe it's not going to take over all of Concord, but there's room for one really good development right here. And I think that was the basic strategy. They're trying to catch a wave. They're trying to be on the cutting edge of a wave, namely the wave of the movement of these high-value uses out from the center. And meanwhile, another thing is going on, and that's 495 out here. And the transportation planners in Massachusetts purposely built the outer beltway quite far out from the inner beltway. A more typical place to put it, if they'd have put the outer beltway kind of at the edge of the metro at that time in the 60s and 70s, they probably would have put it in here. But they purposely put it farther out because they wanted to kind of use transportation infrastructure to almost create a little bit of a green belt, to pull that next area of commercial and high-density development far enough out from the previous one so there'd be some sort of open space in between. So 495 is pretty far out there. As a result, 495 didn't take off right away in terms of development of commercial spaces. So at the time when Lindy's making this decision, 495 is kind of just getting started as a location for high-tech offices and labs and so forth. But what actually happened in the 1980s is 495 did really take off, especially where the Mass Pike crosses here and where 93 crosses here. But what actually happened is the development leapfrogged over Concord and went all the way out to 495. And also what happened is there was a cycle, a big cycle in the real estate and the financial markets in the 1980s, which made there be a period of time when they couldn't really build anyway. So I mean, that's my sense of kind of the big picture of what the strategy was and sort of how it failed. But it was not a bad idea at the time, you know? Yeah.
You know, they didn't get their permits, I think, until was 87, and there was, you didn't seem to hint at it last class, but it looked like they sat on the land for at least a year before they seriously pursued permits. Did that suggest they were just trying to flip the land?
Yeah, well, I think that I don't think they were trying to flip the land, and I don't think they really sat on it, but I think that they felt that time was ultimately on their side, that, as we're going to talk about later today, land is really an option. And you don't have to, exercise the option right away. And so if they had a good location that had a future to it, then it wasn't all that crucial that they implement it right away. But I think that ultimately that didn't pan out because Concord didn't turn out to be part of the agglomeration of high-tech usage. But I think that's a reasonable and plausible strategy that the business ran. Okay, let's go on here. These are my notes for that. Whenever you're doing this kind of thing, it is high risk, but with high risk comes potentially very high returns. So, and keep in mind, I mean, Boston Properties, even back then, was a big company. They had a lot of other, investments. They could take a bit of a risk with one investment without, risking the whole company. So, oftentimes, people do that. They'll have I guess I described that a little bit in terms of the Ohio Teachers Pension Fund and the development project example that we talked about on the very first day out in Milpitas, California. Where you take a portion of your investment funds and you allocate them to a more high-risk strategy in hopes of getting some high returns, but you're not betting the whole farm on that. Okay, any other thoughts or comments about that? Yeah.
Would you be able to, address, my question is, how does the town hall or during the town meeting, how did they decide that it became restaurant and hotel prior to the office? Like, how does...
I don't know any of the specifics of that, but town meetings are kind of as the case described. It's literally direct democracy, so anybody can go there, and what happens, it's like twice a year, and they all meet in the auditorium of the town high school or something, and they've got a bunch of items on the agenda they have to go through, and if there's some issue that, the people who are going to attend the town meeting, it's going to be a small minority of the actual population of the town. It's going to be people who have some particular interest in the issues that are, on the what they call on the warrant. And so if that was some sort of a zoning ordinance that needed to be approved at the town meeting, that would have been probably, you would have had the people there who really cared about some particular zoning change that they either wanted or didn't want. And probably that thing was not one of either of those. Here's a very basic point about the nature of property value, land value in particular. It's called the residual theory of land value. And let's think about what gives, well, real estate fundamentally is land, right? Land is what distinguishes real estate from other types of investments. And so what is the nature of land value? And the type of, I mean, you have land that has value in and of itself, right? Agricultural land is valuable for that land itself can produce great crops, or timberland producing trees or whatever. But land that underlies commercial property, urban land, has value only because it is there's what you call a derived demand good. The demand for it is not for it in itself, it's for that you need it to do something else that there's demand for. So here's a very simple example. In this case, it's an industrial land, but it could be anything. The point is, you build physical capital onto the land. That physical capital produces stuff of value. In this example, it's a clothing factory, so the finished goods are clothes. So what's happening is raw material is going into the factory, the cloth, and the factory consists of machines, and buildings, and management, and other productive factors go in there. Energy to operate the machines, labor to run it, including the management to manage the thing. And of course, we need land because the building has to go somewhere. And it needs to be located in a location that's good to put a factory like this. So if you look at the economics of this, the finished goods, what's the value that this piece of property is being produced from this piece of property for the society, for the economy, is $10 million a year worth of clothing. But in terms of value add, in terms of ability to pay, the let's say the raw material, the cloth, and the energy that has to go in there is $4 million. And the labor, including the management, is $5 million. So the total cost of the goods sold is $9 million. So the gross margin is only $1 million a year. So we're producing $10 million worth of clothes, but there's only a $1 million difference between the cost of what's going in and the value of what's going out. Now, there's still capital that needs to be paid for. And the machinery to produce the clothing and the building that the machineries have to be located in, maybe that's got already a rental cost of $900,000 a year. In other words, maybe it's, I don't know, $9 million worth of building and machines, but we get a perpetual loan at 10% or something. We pay $900,000 a year for use of this capital. So now we're down to $100,000 is left over. That's what you could pay to the landowner to rent the land site. The point is that all these other costs have to be paid first before we can pay the landowner. Because all of these other things will walk away if you don't pay them what their value is, what their opportunity cost is. You have to pay the $4 million for the energy and the cloth, or the owners, the producers of the cloth and the energy will sell it to somebody else, because this is the market price of the energy and the cloth. You have to pay the $5 million to the labor and the management, or they'll go and work for some other company, because that's the market value of them. They can walk away, they can move. Same thing with the capital. Ultimately, they're not going to build the building or rent you the machines or whatever unless you pay the opportunity cost for them. The one thing that can't leave is the land, so it's last in line, right? It gets the residual, it gets what's left over. Yeah.
I'm curious if there are any cases where instead of bottom down, instead of the land being last, the land is first because they have the leverage. And I can give an example. For instance, a coffee shop in a very very, very crowded place, right?
No, you're absolutely right. I presented this in one direction, I could have presented it in the other direction, but it's still a residual. So while it just gets the leftover, it also gets all of the leftover. So let's say the price of cloth suddenly went up and they could sell these now for $15 million. But all these other things still cost the same.
It will squeeze.
Now there's $5,100,000 for the land. So the land, it gets, it's like a levered,
They will squeeze the margin. They can squeeze the gross margin as much as they can. But can they make some kind of business perform in a loss or operate in a loss just to be there?
well, not in the long run, right?
Excuse me?
Not in the long run. So maybe where you're going is that this land is also going to be competing against other parcels of land, and may have unique characteristics. And if there's another use, if maybe suddenly they can only sell the cloth for $8 million, and this thing is going to be a loss, they can't afford to pay anything for the land. In the long run, this is going to leave this land. And maybe there's another use that would be able to bid a higher price for the land. So in the long run, or in equilibrium, the uses that can bid the highest prices for each location will be the uses that occur on those locations. That will reflect the highest and best use of each location. And in a freely functioning land market, in the long run, or as we move towards equilibrium, all the locations get used to their maximum value, and it maximizes the value of the whole society. So that's the essence of a freely functioning land market. But it also gives you an idea of the nature of land value. And if you keep in mind that the value of property always consists of these two components, if you can have so the property value always consists of land value plus structure value. Therefore, land value equals structure value property value minus structure value, right? Now, with property value, what gets traded in the real estate market is the combination of the two, the property, right? The property asset, which includes the land and the structure stuck together. But analytically, we can think of it, we can turn it around and derive the land value as the property value, the thing that's traded, whose value we can observe in the market, minus the structure value. The structure value is basically, that's construction cost. That's what it costs to build the structure. So, so this is the sort of the essence of property, that it consists of these two components. Now, each of these two components has sort of different behavioral characteristics over the long run in terms of their value dynamics. Because the structure is going to age. And as it ages, it's going to depreciate. And as it does that, other things being equal, the land is going to become a larger component of the property value. And land does not depreciate. But land is more risky than structures. Structure is a very, easily replicable thing. It has a very clear opportunity cost, and that opportunity cost doesn't tend to vary that much over time. It's a relatively low risk thing, and it generates an income stream. It's also relatively low risk because it's there already. You can see what it is. So the land value component, which is really, the land is in essence a call option on the next structure, right? If you think about what gives the land value distinct from the structure, it's the fact that if you own the land, you do have the right to tear down that structure and replace it with another structure. So that's kind of the thing that distinguishes the land value or the land claim from the structure value and the structure claim. So this land component of the total property value is more risky. It's the more risky component. But it's also the component that does not depreciate in general. We've seen how land value actually can fall or rise, but at least in general it doesn't systematically depreciate, whereas structures almost always systematically depreciate. So over time, this higher growth, higher risk component of the property value increases as a component of the total property value. So over time, properties tend to become more risky, but higher growth. Okay? What are the implications here? What does that mean? So what we think about, from the perspective of investment, what does this analysis, does it help you with anything?
It leans decisions in the direction of waiting.
In what sense?
That because you have that option, if you commit now, and you're on your wider location within a metro is in a certain trajectory of growth, then a lot of times it makes sense to wait. You don't want to build a bunch of townhouses and then you become in the middle of a secondary business district and you could have built a skyscraper.
Okay, so if you're buying a property whose value is mostly its land value, in other words, if that's a property, obviously if it's a vacant property, the entire value is its land value, as was the case with Walden. But if you're buying a property that has a structure on there, it might be a new structure that therefore most of the value of the property is the structure. And so that doesn't have much optionality in it. We don't need to worry that much about that. It's going to be a relatively low-risk investment, relatively high-income investment, versus you might buy a property that's got a structure on there, but it's already pretty old, or it's pretty far removed from what now is the highest and best use for that site. Then you're kind of buying something that, at least in a large proportion, is actually an option. It's actually land value. And then you have all these issues about how long should we wait to tear it down and so forth. So this is a fundamental dynamic that happens with property investment, and it really governs substantially the nature of the investment. Is it high risk, high return, low yield, or is it low risk, moderate return, we'll say, high yield? Very different kinds of investment, but it's all commercial real estate. Okay, with that in mind as some very fundamental basics, I want to go quickly through a classical model that is related to what we've been talking about. This is called the monocentric city model. It's a very abstract model, but the beauty of scientific models is exactly that they simplify the world to the point that you can clearly see some basic things that are important. Somebody said that, I might have mentioned this, I forget, I already mentioned this class, but the best model, if you think about maps are models, right? So the very best map, the one that's most accurate, would be a map that's the size of the whole Earth. Right? Then you could represent on the map everything exactly where it is in the real world. But that would not be a useful model. So, it would not be a useful map. So useful models precisely are models that are eliminating some parts of the real world so that you can see clearly some crucial relationships. So I say that to motivate you about the monocentric model because this is a very simplified model of a city. And indeed, the version I'm presenting here is an even simplified version of the classical monocentric city model. So you'll go in more depth in this in Professor Wheaton's class. But what I'm presenting here is kind of the essence of what I think every real estate investor should understand. And so the model is that the city is located on what we call a featureless plane. It's on a flat two-dimensional surface which is everywhere identical. And the city consists of, everybody in the city works at a single point. You can think of it as the central business district, the downtown. So it's a single dimensionless point. So everybody that lives in the city has to commute every day to this point. And furthermore, so therefore the rest of the city consists of nothing but housing. And indeed it's housing of a uniform density, just to make this model really simple. So all the residents of Circlopolis live in this circle surrounding the central point, and they all commute from wherever they live in this circle to this central point for their livelihoods. Okay? Now, if I take a transept through this city, from one edge, from beyond one edge, through the city to through the center and out the other edge, and I look at the value of the land, or the locations, actually the value of the built property, and I think of it in terms of an annual rental value, I'm going to get a shape like this. Beyond the city boundary, so here's the central point here, and here's the boundary on one side, and here's the boundary on the other side. This is just a transept through that circular city. So beyond the boundary on this side, the land is not urbanized. Let's say it's agricultural value, and let's say it can produce $500 a year per acre worth of net agricultural profit. So if you wanted to get the farmer to sell you that land, you'd have to bid a price equal to the present value of $500 a year forever. Or you can just rent it forever for $500 a year. Okay, that's the opportunity value of the land in its non-urban use. And to convert it to urban use, you're going to need to build buildings on it. And in particular, with Circlopolis, very simple, you're going to build houses. And you're going to build, in particular, 2 houses per acre. And each house, let's say it's like a $50,000 construction, so that's $100,000 of construction for the 2 houses per acre. And we're going to have our 10% perpetual loan, so on an annualized basis, it's $10,000 a year of construction rent. You can think of it. So to pay the builder to build those houses, it suffices to pay $10,000 a year forever for 2 houses. Each house contains one person. One person lives there. So this is a very simple town. So we have a density of 2 people per acre. Now, all these people have to commute to the center. And the transportation cost is $250 per year per mile of distance to the center. Right? They all have to commute every day to the center. So the farther they are from the center, the greater is going to be that cost. This transportation cost, by the way, is not just the gasoline for their cars and the wear and tear on their tires and the capital cost of the cars. It's also the value of their time that they lose in that commute. So the whole thing works out to be $250 per person, per year, per mile of distance from the center. So what's going to be the rent for housing, for property here in Circlopolis? And it's going to be traced by the top line here. So the residents that live at the outer edge, we always, if you're dealing with monocentric models, you start at the outer edge. And because at the outer edge, there's no location premium. At the outer edge, by definition, you just have to pay the farmer for his land, and you have to pay the builder to build the house. There's nothing else that you have to pay for. Except you're going to have to pay your transportation cost all the way to the center. And so what is that transportation cost? $250 per person times the radius of the city times the density, the number of people per acre. So what is this edge? What's the radius here? Anyway, this city has 1 million people. Oh, here it is. Well, it has 1 million people, and if we've got 2 people per acre, there's 640 acres in a square mile. So there's 1,280 people per square mile. Divide 1 million into 1,280, and you see that the city has a certain number of square miles. And remember the geometry, the formula for the area of a circle is pi times the radius squared. Therefore, the radius is the square root of the area divided by pi. It's just algebra. Therefore, the radius of this city, given the population of 1 million and the density of 2 people per acre, the radius is 16 miles. So this circle goes 16 miles out from the center. So notice this is very simple, but these are roughly order of magnitude realistic numbers for a typical city. So we now know where this edge point is. And the crucial thing is the rent gradient. The rent gradient has to be, the rent gradient is how much the rent increases. And remember, values just, you can think of value as just being a multiple of rent. So the rent has to increase at a rate, as you move towards the center, it's got to increase at a rate that just equals the savings in the transportation commuting costs. Otherwise, what? Your big hint, this is an economic model. This is a model that comes from urban economics. What do we always care about? Equilibrium in the market, supply and demand all has to equilibrate. The people that are living this distance from the center have to be just as satisfied with where they're living as the people who are living this distance from the center. Otherwise, everybody will move one direction or the other, and they'll bid up the prices in one direction, they'll bid down the prices in the other direction. We won't have an equilibrium until everybody is equally well off, given where they are and given the prices they're paying. It's the crucial definition or the crucial criterion of equilibrium in this kind of spatial model. And what that means is that the rent gradient has to exactly equal the transportation cost savings per acre, right? Because we're pricing things per acre. So the rent gradient is the transportation cost per person times the density. And since we know how far the edge is and we know this slope, what this gradient is, we therefore know the peak value at the center. Right? So that's the monocentric model. And in this case, if you have $250 per person per mile, times 2 people per acre, that's $500 per mile of rent gradient, and 16 miles means it's an $8,000 premium that people would pay in equilibrium to live right in the center. So the cost per acre of a built property, the rent per acre of a built property at the edge is $10,500. Consists of the $500 agricultural opportunity cost plus the $10,000 worth of 2 houses worth of construction. $10,500 at the edge, $18,500 at the center, which that extra $8,000 is what we call location premium. That's the extra value from being closer to a more central location. That's the monocentric city model in its stripped down, most simple form. Any questions? Yeah?
How does it factor when you have like land constraints, like a harbor?
Glad you asked that because I'm gonna get into that, but I'm gonna skim through it real quickly. This is all explained in chapter 4, and I need to fly through it fairly quickly, but we'll talk about some of that kind of thing. This is all we've been just talking about. Here's a useful little mathematical fact. For relatively small increments, the square root is basically equal to the half of the thing. So basically, if you're increasing the, if you increase the area of this city by 10%, you're going to increase the radius by about 5%, because for those small increments, square root is about a half of the thing you start out with. So, so what we're looking at here, we're going to look at the effect of changing these parameters, and it's what you call comparative statics. We're comparing the model under one set of inputs with the model under another set of inputs. We're not saying how you get from one to the other. We're ignoring the dynamics. And I think your question, Josh, relates to this, because you're wondering if, we changed the population or whatnot. Maybe your question, one question, this is also an interesting point. Suppose that Circlopolis was a half Circlopolis. Suppose there's an ocean over here, or a Lake Michigan, and the CBD is right there, because it wants to be a port or something. So then, on the otherwise featureless plane, it's going to be a half of a circle. So the area of half of a circle is related how to the area of a whole circle? Half of it. Which means for for the same population and same density, the radius has to be relative to if we had the whole 360-degree arc. The radius has to be square root of 2 times whatever the radius would otherwise have been. So, in other words, if we could have the whole arc, the city would have been like this, but we can't build in Lake Michigan, so therefore the boundary of the city is farther out. And remember, everything, you start from the boundary and you go in. So the location rent in downtown Chicago is going to be that much higher than it would otherwise be, just because of Lake Michigan. Anybody from Chicago? All right. So actually, a lot of cities are on the coast, and Boston doesn't lose a whole half, but Boston, loses probably, I don't know, a third or something from, Boston Harbor and whatnot. And New York loses some, and so on. But you can also lose stuff just from, like, swamps that you can't build on, or lakes. Like, what about Minneapolis, the land of 10,000 lakes, that they can't build on one of those lakes. Or what about a conservation-minded population that really wants to set aside a lot of land for parks? So all of that's going to push the radius out and thereby increase the average location premiums that are in the land values. So first thing we want to consider is what happens if we simply increase the population, leave the density constant. You have to increase the area of the circle, and the radius is going to increase by the square root of that. We start from the same point. We got the same rent gradient because we got the same density, same transportation cost. We're just changing one thing at a time here. So that's going to increase the real estate values all throughout the metropolitan area. Percentage-wise, it's going to push up the values at the periphery here, the former periphery, more than at the center, right? All right, that's the first point. Now, maybe this relates maybe to another aspect of your question. Suppose the city grows in population, just like we had it doing here, only now it can't expand the radius. Maybe it's an island, or maybe it's a peninsula, or maybe it's surrounded by a greenbelt that restricts expansion. What do they call it, like have in Portland, Oregon, what is it called?
An urban growth boundary.
Urban growth boundary, right? And then what's going to happen when the population grows? The density has to increase. And if the density increases, the rent gradient increases, other things being equal. The rent gradient is density times transportation cost per person, per acre. So now you're going to have increasing costs all over the city, but now the increase in cost is greater in the center. Just the opposite of what we had before, relative, periphery versus center. Yeah.
So I think I get what this effectively, but I want to bounce it off you. So, what if the city disperses so much, say like Houston, that it actually starts getting diseconomies? So like the outer periphery isn't worth the commute time any longer because of
so it might become polycentric. You might have a whole new center that develops.
Sure,
we're going to get to that next week.
Yeah, sure. Polycentric can certainly happen and does happen, but I think there are possibly even limits to having multi-nodal cities. And would this start occurring, would the city just naturally start densifying because of the diseconomies of dispersion?
Well, I think that you're suggesting that there is a certain radius beyond which people won't move. And that would have, I guess, the same type of effect that this would have, right? It's kind of the same thing. Okay, but by the way, I don't think we've reached that point ever anywhere yet. Maybe you guys are the first generation that you really won't move any farther out. Now, I believe that's probably true. The Generation Xers were the ones that really became like the ex-urbanites, right? They moved like 50 miles out of the city, and they still commuted in their pickup trucks. They probably didn't have to commute all the way into the center because they could get jobs in the edge cities. but that, we're getting sort of polycentric there. But maybe by now we are, but one thing that keeps happening is something I'm going to get into in a minute, which is transportation costs effectively keep going down. Because media, technology, you know, if the transportation costs are the same, only now I only have to commute 3 days a week instead of 5 days a week, because 2 days a week I can work at home, then effectively the transportation costs per year are reduced by 40%. And that's the kind of thing that's happening. You know, so, all right. Yeah, but we're kind of, I sort of cast these in terms of principles, but I'm going to just make it quicker than that. So here's the effect of transportation cost reduction. If transportation costs are reduced, only everything else the same, then the rent gradient is going to fall, right? And what that's going to do, though, what it's going to do one of two things. And the most likely thing that it's going to do is people are going to take that reduction in transportation costs and they're going to use that savings partly to buy more land, to have, you know, houses on bigger lots. And so it's actually going to push the radius out. So they'll have a lower rent gradient for two reasons. One, the transport cost is lower per person per year, per mile. But secondly, the density is lower as people, you know, use more land. And so the rent gradient is the density times the transport cost. So for both of those reasons, the rent gradient falls. And when you get that result, the central value falls in absolute terms. And around the periphery, you can get rises in value. So this is a big part of the story of what has happened for generations, for 2 centuries, since the Industrial Revolution in cities all around the world. Is transportation costs per mile have been falling, densities have been falling, and central values have been falling, relatively speaking anyway. And cities have been expanding. And peripheral values have been rising, at least from where it came from the previous periphery. So that's one result. Now, you could conceivably have another result. Oh, did I show it? No. Well, what if the boundary didn't expand? What if you didn't permit people to use some of their transport cost savings to buy bigger, you know, yards and whatnot? Then you still have a reduction in rent gradient if we have a reduction in transport costs holding everything else the same. So then property values would fall throughout the city. You wouldn't have this increase at the periphery here. Another huge thing that happens is income growth. Real per capita income growth is ubiquitous over time. In most countries, over reasonable periods of time, there is real income growth, and that has a huge effect because people use this income for buying more land. Usually people like to have more land for one reason or another, one way or another. And but on the other hand, there's 2 effects that occur here. A decrease in density as people use some of their additional income to buy more land, but also an increase in transportation costs per mile per person because, other things being equal, remember, one of the components of transportation costs, a big component of it, is the value of people's time. And the value of their time increases with their income. So we have these sort of 2 offsetting effects, and which one is going to dominate? The decrease in density or the increase in transportation costs? Because the decrease in density will reduce the rent gradient. The increase in transportation costs will increase the rent gradient. And depends on which one is stronger, which one will dominate. And it can be a function of the culture in which the city is located. Some cultures, they don't, when they get richer, they don't care that much about buying bigger yards. They like to live in high-density configurations. They like to live, in high-rises, apparently in China, I guess. Or maybe they just have to, right? The regulations require it. So in that case, income would not decrease the density. So it would just increase the transportation cost, and you'd have an increase in the rent gradient. But at least in most countries, Western countries like the U.S., Canada, Australia, most European countries, I think this is the effect of the increased income is probably more like the effect of the reduction in transportation costs. People do use some of that income to buy extra land, even though the transportation cost is increased per person, it seems like that's dominated by the reduction in density, so the rent gradient falls and central location rents fall. But it won't necessarily be that way. The last point, we got like 5 more minutes, right? The last point comes from the beginning of the next chapter, chapter 5, and this is a bit more subtle, and I would encourage you to already look at the Stellar Forum, because we had a couple of very good questions on the forum. I forget who of you posted it. With Michael Castagnola, Michael and Anwar. Anwar. All right, you guys both posted similar but actually complementary questions. I was able to start out by answering Michael's question. I think you said that my answer was good for you. And then Anwar posed a kind of a follow-up question, really, that I answered. I don't know if that answer was good for you, because I didn't have time to check. But read those answers. I put in a fair amount of effort. It's about this point that comes at the beginning of chapter 5. And here's where we begin to make the story not quite as simple as the simple monocentric model. Because here we're going to get some dynamics, change over time, and we're going to introduce a crucial element of the real world, which is uncertainty. Nobody knows what the future is going to exactly bring. And when you, the way that comes into play here is you can think of land as essentially an option. Owning the land, as I said before, what the ownership of the land gives you is the right to tear down any existing building, or if there's no building there, so much the better, it gives you the right to build a building there. That's what the ownership of the land essentially gives you. Think about it. If it doesn't give you that, then the land has no value, right? The land per se has no value. If owning the land does not permit you to ever build anything on the land, how does the land have any value? We're not talking about agricultural land here. We're not talking about, we're talking about urban land here. It doesn't have any use or value economically that you can get from it except by building a building on it. If there's already a structure on the land, that's nice. You got that structure, but if you can't demolish and replace that structure with another structure, then the land in and of itself doesn't have any value. The entire value is just that existing structure. Right? So the land is really an option. And options, it's a call option, meaning that it gives you the right, without obligation. It's a crucial part about options. You don't have to exercise them. You can choose when and whether to exercise an option. If you exercise the option, you get something that's valuable. In this case, you get a building. But to exercise the option, you have to pay something. In this case, you have to pay the construction cost. So that is what, for you Sloanies who've taken lots of finance, you know about call options, right? And classical call option is on stock. And maybe it's an option to buy Procter & Gamble at $50 a share, and presently the price of Procter & Gamble is $45 a share, so that why would you pay anything for something that gives you the right to buy something for $50? You could buy it directly for $45. Why would you do that? Because, what?
Yeah.
Right? Why would you pay some money for a $50 call option on Procter & Gamble when the current Procter & Gamble price is $45?
Because of what you can do with that option in the future.
Right. Why and how would that become valuable? How would that become valuable?
Because you can make a more profitable use of it when the market conditions change.
In particular, if the price of Procter & Gamble goes above $45, indeed above $50, then all of a sudden, if the price goes up to, say, $55, this option gives you the right to buy it for $50. Now, all of a sudden, just by cashing the option in, you got $5. Now, that won't happen for sure, but it may happen over the life of the option, right? And since there's some chance of that happening, and meanwhile, suppose it never happens, then the option expires worthless. But it's still zero value, right? So the worst you can have is zero, and the best you can have is something positive. So there's no negative, there's no loss possibility, other than, of course, because of that, you're gonna pay a price for the option, of course, you lose what you pay for the option. But the point is, it gives it option value. That's the essence of land. And in particular, it's land just beyond some growth boundary. Here we're depicting the boundary of the city, the monocentric city. So it's land that's agricultural land. We don't really care about the agricultural value of it. It's the fact that this land can be converted into urban land by building buildings on it when it becomes profitable to do so. And if the city is growing, then this boundary point from which people will commute to the center and therefore for which they will pay housing rents, that is growing and approaching where your land is. So you have an increase in land value that reflects, in particular, it reflects this thing called the irreversibility premium. That's basically the option value. It's the value of this call option. And what it means is that because there's uncertainty, and because options have this asymmetric payoff from uncertainty, in the sense that if the real estate market goes up, you can get a big profit from your option. Just like if Procter & Gamble price goes up to 55, you get a big profit since you only have to pay 50 for it. Versus if the real estate market goes down, you don't have to develop. You don't have to build anything. You can just wait. So the downside is truncated. It can't go very low. And the upside is the sky's the limit. So because of that, if you build now, if you exercise your option, when you exercise your option, you've then lost the option, right? It's an irreversible thing. You can only exercise an option once. And that's a little bit of an exaggeration with real estate because you could always tear down. You still do have a redevelopment option, right? You could tear down the building and build another building. But that's going to be that's going to be a pretty minuscule thing initially. Over time, that'll grow in value. But so we can think of it as if you exercise that option now and you build that building now, you've given up the option to do that next year or the year after. And just as you study financial options, the option on Procter & Gamble stock, you won't exercise that option as soon as Procter & Gamble price just goes above 50, right? Your option is to buy Procter & Gamble at 50. When you bought the option, it was only at 45, but you paid some money for it. Now Procter & Gamble, sure enough, made a good bet. It's now $50.01. Should you exercise your option and get your 1 cent? No. Well, it goes up to 51. 52. 55? Well, it depends on when the option's going to expire, right? If the option's about to expire and it's at 55, yeah, you can do it. But when does the land option expire? When does the option to develop expire? Never. It's a perpetual option. So you're going to be able to wait with a lot of patience, and you'll wait until the rent is high enough that the value of the building you're going to build is great enough to compensate you for the value of the option you're giving up to building now rather than waiting and holding on to that option. And that difference is called the irreversibility rent premium. And it means that the greater the uncertainty, the more volatility in the real estate market, the greater is the value of this option, the greater is the value of the land. And therefore, the greater is the extra rent that you're going to require before you'd be willing to build and give up your option. Which means that the more uncertainty there is, the more demand there has to be relative to the supply, so that you can charge a high enough rent to get that irreversibility premium. Which means that the more volatility and uncertainty there is in the real estate market, the less development will happen. And therefore, the denser will be the city, the narrower will be the radius. So that's kind of the last point. Here's a numerical example, which actually I worked out to answer Anwar's question. And the point is, options are very risky, but they can be very profitable. When you have high risk, you have high average returns. And the point is that these can be very profitable investments. They ultimately are all about development, converting land. They're also very risky. They don't always pay off. And this is exactly what Ed Lindy was trying to do in the Walden case, I think. He was playing around with a point like that, where there was a growth boundary that was approaching. In his case, it wasn't the difference between agriculture and housing. It was the difference between housing and commercial, Class A commercial office. But it's the same idea. It's a boundary of a higher and better use that's moving out, and it's playing with this kind of appreciation here. So I have a numerical example that you can study at your leisure, and it is actually presented in an Excel workbook that's available on the resources section on the website. But that's the point that I wanted to cover for today. So a lot of stuff. I'm gonna have like a 5-minute.
Yeah, 5-10 minutes.
Maybe
we'll start.
reconvene at 4:45 by that clock. Okay. Okay. And I'll come back around.